Something is breaking apart inside the United States government. Not slowly, not quietly, all at once, in broad daylight, in federal courtrooms, in polling numbers, in tornado warnings that never came, in crop reports that got it wrong by the size of an entire state. A federal judge in Rhode Island is weighing contempt charges against the Justice Department right now. A federal judge in Alabama is asking whether government lawyers lied to a grand jury. The approval ratings are not just bad, they are historically, catastrophically bad. 76% of Americans disapprove of how this administration is handling the cost of living. 76%. And yet, somehow, that is not even close to the most alarming part of this story. Because beneath all of it, beneath the courtroom failures, the broken weather systems, the collapsing poll numbers, something far more deliberate is happening. Something that has been building quietly since the very first day of this administration. A targeting, a systematic, calculated, undeniable targeting. And once you see the full picture clearly, you cannot unsee it. Let's start with the courtrooms, because that's where the cracks first became impossible to ignore. In Rhode Island, a federal judge is sitting across from lawyers from the United States Department of Justice, and she is not satisfied. A government lawyer stood before her and admitted, out loud, in open court, that he had deliberately withheld information from her. Not by accident, not by oversight. Deliberately. He said he did it because the Department of Homeland Security told him to, and then he apologized. Profusely, he said. He begged for the judge's forgiveness. But here's the thing about lying to a federal judge, sorry doesn't really cover it. The judge is now weighing contempt charges against DOJ officials and Homeland Security officials both. That is not a minor procedural issue. That is a constitutional crisis unfolding in real time inside an American courtroom. And while that was happening in Rhode Island, another federal judge in Alabama was looking at something equally alarming. The Southern Poverty Law Center, one of the most recognized civil rights organizations in American history, had just been hit with a criminal indictment by Trump's Justice Department. An indictment that legal observers described as bizarre from the moment it was filed. And the SPLC did something in response that almost never happens in American courts. They asked the judge to let them see the grand jury transcript. They want to know exactly what Trump's lawyers said behind closed doors to convince that grand jury to sign off on this indictment. Because based on the indictment itself, it appears those lawyers may have told the grand jury things that were simply not true, either about the law or about the organization itself. If that is confirmed, the case doesn't just get weakened, it gets thrown out entirely, and the lawyers involved could face contempt, disbarment, the end of their careers. The arraignment is set for Thursday. The judge is deciding right now whether to release that transcript. But as serious as all of that is, as unprecedented as it feels, the courtroom failures are only one layer of what is happening here. Because outside those courtrooms, across the country, the consequences of this administration's decisions are landing on real people in ways that are impossible to dismiss. And some of those consequences were entirely tragically preventable. Think about the last time you heard a tornado warning. That sound, that alert on your phone, that voice on the radio telling you to take cover. Now imagine you never got it. Imagine the storm is already forming, already rotating, already dropping, and no one warned you. That is exactly what happened in Kansas City, Kansas. Last month, when the tornadoes came, residents had roughly 30 minutes of notice, not for the tornado itself, but for the watch. The early warning, the one that is supposed to come hours before the storm even arrives, giving families time to prepare, time to move, time to protect themselves. 30 minutes, and the reason people didn't get that warning in time is not complicated, it is not a mystery. Weather balloon launches, the kind that forecasting offices in the Great Plains have been conducting every single morning for decades, every day at 7 a.m. Without fail, those launches did not happen that morning, because the National Weather Service had been gutted, staffing levels slashed, positions eliminated, and on the morning those tornadoes formed, there simply were not enough people to do the job that has kept Americans safe for generations. This is not ideological, this is not political opinion. This is what happens when you break something, it stops working. People got hurt, homes were destroyed, and the warning system that was supposed to prevent the worst of it was not there when it mattered most. But the Weather Service was not the only casualty of the government cuts sweeping through federal agencies. Across the country, farmers were about to find out that the system they depend on to make critical business decisions had also quietly fallen apart. The United States Department of Agriculture produces crop estimates. It sounds technical. It sounds boring. But those numbers matter enormously to traders, to markets, to the farmers themselves who use those projections to decide when to sell their harvest, how to plan their finances, whether to hold or move their product. Last year, the Agriculture Department released an estimate of the American corn harvest, and then they had to revise it and then revise it again and again, until finally, in January, they discovered they had missed 1.3 million acres of corn. 1.3 million acres, an area larger than the entire state of Delaware. just gone from the numbers, uncounted, invisible. The department called it the worst projection in recent memory, and the reason it happened is the same reason the weather balloons didn't go up. The National Agriculture Statistics Service, the division responsible for those crop reports, had its staff cut from 800 people down to 500. 23,000 Agriculture Department employees gone across the whole department in a single year, and the result was that American farmers already struggling, already facing rising costs for fertilizer, for diesel, for transportation, were now operating on faulty information in a market that punishes faulty information immediately and without mercy. And that's before you even account for the tariffs, the trade disruptions, the export markets that have tightened or closed entirely because of policy decisions made from the top with apparently no understanding of the ground-level consequences, farmers squeezed from every direction at once. But even all of that is still not the deepest part of what is unraveling, because while federal agencies were being hollowed out and real-world consequences were piling up on real American families, something else was happening at the highest levels of foreign policy and military decision-making. Something that, when you see the pattern clearly, raises questions that have no comfortable answers. American troops had been sent into harm's way in the Middle East. Hundreds of them had already been wounded. And where do wounded American soldiers go when they need care after being injured in the Middle East? They go to Germany. The United States has a massive military presence in Germany, facilities, infrastructure, the capacity to receive and treat and support troops evacuated from conflict zones. Germany is the backbone of American military logistics for any engagement in that region. And then, without warning, without explanation, without any apparent military rationale, the announcement came. 5,000 American troops pulled out of Germany. The Pentagon was blindsided. Military officials couldn't explain it, analysts couldn't explain it. And then, as people started asking questions, something familiar surfaced. The president had been on the phone with Vladimir Putin shortly before making the announcement. And here's where the pattern becomes impossible to dismiss, because this is not the first time this has happened. Back in 2020, during the first term, the exact same sequence of events played out. Phone call with Putin, announcement to pull thousands of troops from Germany, Pentagon blindsided, no explanation offered. That time, it didn't happen because Trump lost the election and the order was reversed, but now he's back, and the sequence has repeated itself identically. Phone call with Putin, announcement to pull troops from Germany, Pentagon blindsided, and this time there is no election coming to stop it. This time, the troops are already fighting a war in the Middle East. This time, the infrastructure being dismantled is the very infrastructure keeping those soldiers alive and supported. Pulling U.S. troops out of Europe, weakening NATO's ground presence, reducing American military capacity on the continent, these are things Vladimir Putin has wanted for decades. They benefit Russia enormously. They cost the United States enormously. And somehow, every single time the two leaders speak, the American president comes away ready to give Russia exactly what it wants. The people watching this most closely are not just alarmed, they are trying to process what it means for the troops in the field, what it means for alliances built over 70 years, what it means for a country that is simultaneously escalating a war and dismantling its own ability to fight it. But here's the thing. All of this, the courtrooms, the tornadoes, the crop reports, the troop withdrawals, the Putin phone calls, all of it is happening at the same time as something else. Something that has been building since the very first day of this administration, something more deliberate, more sustained, and more consequential than any single policy failure or any single courtroom drama. A systematic campaign. Targeted, documented, undeniable. And it has been aimed at one specific group of Americans from the very beginning. And just when you think you understand the full scope of what is happening, when you think you have seen the worst of it, the picture gets wider and darker. And the ground shifts beneath everything you thought you understood about where this country is heading. From the very first day, not the second week, not after settling in, not after getting comfortable, from the very first full day back in office, this administration declared war on diversity programs across the entire country, in government, in universities, in law firms, in private businesses, anywhere federal leverage could reach, it reached. And then the firings began, not random, not scattered, targeted. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Charles C.Q. Brown, gone. The Librarian of Congress, Carla Hayden, gone. Gwen Wilcox from the National Labor Relations Board, gone. Robert Primus from the Surface Transportation Board, gone. Alvin Brown from the NTSB, gone. Peggy Carr, head of the National Center for Education Statistics, gone. Willie Phillips from the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, gone. Lisa Cook from the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, gone. One after another, high-profile, high-ranking black public officials removed from some of the most powerful positions in the United States government. And when Elon Musk's Dodge operation began slicing through the federal workforce, the cuts did not land evenly. The agencies that employed disproportionately large numbers of black federal workers were hit the hardest. Reporters covering this noted something that should have stopped the country cold. Nothing had moved this fast, this far backward for black Americans in the federal government since 1912. Since Woodrow Wilson walked into the White House and resegregated the entire federal workforce. And then came the policy changes that most people never even heard about. The executive order signed by Lyndon Johnson in 1965, the one banning federal contractors from discriminating on the basis of race, rescinded. Gone on day one. And then, less than a month later, a federal acquisition regulation clause with a quiet bureaucratic title was also removed. That clause was called the Prohibition of Segregated Facilities. It explicitly banned federal contractors from maintaining segregated restaurants, segregated waiting rooms, segregated drinking fountains. Donald Trump's administration reached back through decades of civil rights progress and removed it. Deliberately, quietly. And then the Fair Housing Act, the 1968 law that says you cannot refuse to rent or sell a home to someone because of their race, stopped being enforced. Current and former employees of the Department of Housing and Urban Development confirmed it. Enforcement dropped, the law remained on the books, but no one was making sure it was followed anymore. Black unemployment, which had reached a record low of 4.8% under the previous administration, spiked to 7.5%, the highest of any racial group in the country. And then the Supreme Court moved. The conservative majority, including every single Trump appointee on the bench, voted to gut the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The crowning achievement of the entire civil rights movement. Justice Elena Kagan, in her dissent, said it would likely cause the largest rollback of minority representation since the end of Reconstruction after the Civil War. And within days, Republican governors were already acting. Louisiana canceled elections that were already underway. South Carolina moved to eliminate its one majority-minority congressional district. Tennessee began drawing maps designed to make all 9 of its congressional seats white, despite 1 in 6 residents being black. This was not a slow drift. This was not gradual erosion. This was a coordinated, rapid, all-fronts dismantling, and the people who had been watching it build from the very beginning knew the hardest fight was still ahead. But the hardest fight is exactly what people are choosing to show up for, because what happened next was not silence, it was not surrender. It was pushback, organized, immediate, and growing louder by the day. In Louisiana, the moment the governor canceled those elections, voters and civil rights groups went straight to court. A coalition filed suit almost immediately, arguing that suspending an election already underway with tens of thousands of ballots already cast was not just legally questionable, it was an open assault on democracy itself. The ACLU stepped in, representing those voters, fighting in both state and federal court to stop the chaos, to count the votes, to force accountability, and their message was clear. Elections belong to the people, not to politicians looking to redraw the rules mid-game to protect their own power. In Washington, Democratic House Leader Hakeem Jeffries stood up and laid out a direct, unapologetic counter-strategy. Sue, redraw, win. States where Democrats control the legislature are already being asked to draw maps that push back against what Republicans are doing in the South. Voting rights organizations are mapping out how Democrats could gain as many as 22 House seats by 2028, if they fight on every front available to them. Churches are getting involved. Clergy are speaking out. Legal organizations are filing cases in North Carolina, Texas, Missouri, and beyond. The resistance is not abstract. It is organized, funded, and determined. And the stakes could not be higher because what is being fought over right now is not just a congressional seat here or a district line there. What is being fought over is whether the multiracial democracy that generations of Americans marched, bled, and died to build is going to survive this moment. That is the actual question on the table. Not a hypothetical, not a future concern. Right now, this year, in courtrooms, in state houses, in election offices, in the streets. A country being pulled in 2 directions at once, one toward a future that includes everyone, and one back toward a past that never should have existed. Where it lands depends on what people do next. It depends on whether people stay informed, stay engaged, and refuse to look away. This story is still being written, and if this kind of in-depth reporting matters to you, share your thoughts in the comments below. What stood out to you most? If you want to stay on top of stories like this one, like this video, and subscribe so you never miss what's coming next. Because trust me, this is far from over.